Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the annual lecture of the Society of Portrait Sculptors. Our speaker today needs no introduction. Martin Jennings is one of the foremost figurative sculptors working in Britain today, and you will all know his work very well, from the Betjeman in St Pancras to the Orwell outside the BBC, or Mary Seacole outside St Thomas's Hospital. So without more ado, you don't want to listen to me, you need to listen to him. And I just want to say there will be a question and answer session at the end of his talk, and a microphone will be going around so that we can all hear it. And thank you very much, and thank you all very much for coming.
Good afternoon. This is a talk about what I call statues, rather than about public sculpture in general, or portrait sculpture, or it's largely about works out of doors, almost all of them made of bronze over the last 150 years or so. I will be including one or two images of works by some members of the audience, because there's an intimidating number of sculptors in front of me at the moment, but I won't be including images of portrait sculptures by and large, by which I mean heads or heads and shoulders. It's specifically about public statuary. This is a tiny detail of a little bow on the bit, on the bridle of a horse in bronze. It's no bigger than my hand, and it is a beautifully modelled little object which is invisible to the public on the Quadriga statue on top of the Wellington Arch at Hyde Park Corner. One of the things I find absolutely delightful and compelling about statuary from the period of the new sculpture at the end of the 19th century and the early 20th century is how ready they were to add the extra, the unnecessary, that little piece that you'd barely notice, but that which contributes to the whole when it's combined with so many other of those little extra bits and pieces. You can't see that bow from the ground, but there'll be just this tiny little moment of something that you can see there that adds to the texture of the work as a whole. This sculpture was unveiled in 1911. It's a figure of Victory, a Nike, the goddess of victory, descending on the chariot of war with an olive branch signifying peace and the palm of victory in the other hand. As she descends on the chariot of war, the horses are reined in by the charioteer, who's represented by a young boy. I always love driving into London, coming down Park Lane and seeing this epic piece of sculpture on the skyline. I really know that I've arrived when I do. Of course, it's a great big fantasy. This sculpture went up 3 years before the appalling carnage of the Western Front in 1914. It's a sculpture born out of idioms from the previous century. Allegorical, ornamental, beautiful, and almost entirely lacking in anything that's savage, brutal, industrial, or about death. I was lucky enough to go up with a friend onto the scaffolding 3 years ago or so when it was being restored, and you could see it in very close detail. One of the wonderful things about this sculpture is what a fabulous outline it makes against the sky from whatever angle you look at it. This is a famous photograph of the sculptor Adrian Jones, who was originally an army vet, so he really knew his horses, having a cup of tea inside the mold of one of those horses, which is a tribute not only to the size of the animal that he was he was sculpting, but also to the robustness of the plaster mould. Every single thing in that workshop seems to be coated like some kind of Christmas cake with dripping plaster. Going up the scaffolding and really looking at in close detail at something that you've only ever seen from the ground before was a thrilling experience. This is the figure of peace in the middle, modelled by Beatrice Stewart, who was also a model for John Singer Sargent and Augustus John. And it has that kind of ease of modelling, that kind of flow, romantic flow of modelling that is so beautiful to perceive and yet so difficult to achieve as a sculptor. Poking up through the floorboards, rather like Poseidon's horses reaching out of the sea. Here's one of the horses' heads. And I find this deeply compelling, not only the knowledge of the horse's anatomy. As I said, he was an army vet, so he really knew his horses. But the flaring of the nostril, the sheer energy of the piece, the alarm around the eyes, the struggle involved in the way they're being pulled back. There you can see one of those little bows, unnecessary but thoroughly enjoyable on the bit. It's the palm of victory held up in one hand. It's almost like these pieces have been shorn off and could be examined in close detail. And in the other hand, the olive of peace. One of the great things about these big monuments that makes them work so well is when very delicate elements are combined with the mass of the sculpture overall. You see it again and again in late 19th century and early 20th century sculpture. And it adds a lightness that makes even more compelling the main body of the sculpture. And these leaves, I think, are superbly well modelled and held so lightly in the sculptor's hands. This is how they used to be cleaned up in the 1930s. Health and safety was rather a different thing. No scaffolding. You just climbed up with a brush and a cloth in your pocket and a bit of kiwi wax and buffed them up. You can see, is it St. George's Hospital in the background there? And you can also see how much work there is to improve those bronzes. But it also expresses something of the dynamic of those horses' rearing heads. So what I find difficult to comprehend in some ways is how so much great sculpture was applied to notions and idioms that in themselves were so suspect. A lot of this sculpture came out of the empire, out of belief in British transcendence. It brought with it a confidence and an assertiveness that made these sculptures possible. And yet, looking back, we find what these sculptures stand for considerably more suspect than those who were looking at them when they were first made would have done. You hardly have to walk more than a few paces from where we are now to see some of the most sumptuous sculpture in the country. This is my favourite sculpture in Trafalgar Square, not only because it's quite diminutive. He's life-size or possibly a little bit over, but barely more than that. He was a small man, Charles I, but it's the combination of the bronze sculpture and the fabulous plinth that it stands on. The scale of both pieces are completely integrated with each other, and I find it just so much more compelling than the pompous erection behind it, which is quite flabbergasting in its self-assertion. Charles I, of course, prorogued Parliament. He set himself up against Parliament. People who do that have what's coming to them. He's looking down Whitehall towards the spot where he had his head lopped off. If you look at that close detail, one of the things that so hugely improves this plinth, in my mind, is the way that the weather has worked on it. It's not only deeply carved and contained within a very slender lateral width, but the weather has steadily improved it by assaulting it over the years. You can take that too far, of course, and something can fall apart, but this is held in a sort of balance between the two. The plinth is almost the whole of the sculpture with this little statue on top. I love it. And just further down the road, a few yards further down the road, the statue of the Duke of Cambridge, by all accounts, a feckless and useless leader of the army, stood out against any reforms in the army and was held responsible for some of the failings in the Boer War. And yet it's a fabulous sculpture again. Sculpted by Captain Adrian Jones, who also made the quadriga. That horse is an absolutely beautiful thing. It's even better with its bundle of hay under it. So again, London is full of statues of people whose reputations we would now find extremely questionable. And yet this is a great democratic art form. You don't have to go into an art gallery to look at these things. Every one of us can look at them and appreciate them. And yet they're so often denigrated as unnecessary pieces of pompous and worthy bronze. This is the same thing from the far side. It has a lot more life in it than the statue of General Haig a bit further down Whitehall. Another sculpture that I hugely admire by Hamo Thornycroft on the Embankment, General Gordon. Gordon was a man with many virtues, but his obsessive proselytizing and his craving of a Christian martyrdom, along with that of some of his troops, again throws a shadow over him. His statue originally stood in Parliament Square until the end of the war, when it was moved out to Embankment. But if you look at the modelling of those trousers and those boots, I can tell you that is a lot harder to do than it might look. As soon as something's achieved, you look at it and think, I could do that, or I could copy that. I've tried to, and it's very, very difficult. Those folds are absolutely beautiful and thoroughly understood. And they're not fussed over. You understand that boot, you know precisely what kind of leather it's made of, and yet it's not it's not fetishizing, it's copying of the material that it represents. A contrapposto pose with the assistance of a cannon. The whole imperial movement in public monuments came to a grinding halt in the First World War. This is a bronze relief by Charles Sargent Jagger, the great sculptor of memorials post the First World War. He himself fought in the trenches, was shot, wounded twice, once at Gallipoli, once on the Western Front. And he came out of the war determined to monumentalize the ordinary soldier in his suffering. And his sculptures bespeak the appalling struggle of the Western Front, the trenches, and the industrial level of slaughter that it involved. This is a relief sculpture you can see, or used to see until they put it into storage, in Tate, Britain. And this is a relief from the Artillery Memorial, his great masterwork, again on Hyde Park Corner. You can walk up there in a quarter of an hour from here. And you can see from that not only he represents soldiers in the moment of being killed. You can see the sheer strain, the physical effort involved in surviving the fighting. No longer the allegorical figures that only 3 years before the war started were erected on Wellington's Arch, just a few yards away. And in a way, the dead soldier that he places at the end of this monument marks the end of a whole period of sculpture. Modernism grew suddenly out of this moment, and monumentalizing ground to a halt, and almost as represented by this figure, it died. Again, this is a fabulous piece of sculpture. If you look at the way that coat is draped, the folds in it, the way that he really pushes a representation of an article of clothing, so that it becomes almost abstract in its conception. And that beautiful hiding of most of the face. There was huge complaint about the inclusion of a dead figure on a monument to the many thousands of dead artillerymen he was commemorating. There's a rather difficult point in the lecture now where I have to move from the sublime to my work, because I think I was asked to come and speak here, not just so that I could look at a large number of pictures of fabulous Victorian statuary that I so admire, but so that I can explain a little bit of what I myself have also attempted to do. So if you will forgive the jarring leap, this is a statue I made of Charles Dickens in Portsmouth to commemorate the 200th anniversary of his birth. There were considerable complaints about putting it up at all, because he said in his will that he didn't want a monument to be built to himself. Or rather, he said he didn't want a memorial to be built to himself. And there were many interpretations of that, which for many years have been understood to mean he didn't want a statue of himself, though more recent interpretations have suggested that it was actually that he didn't want a great big pompous monument inside a cathedral. He wanted to be buried in Rochester. His bones were very annoyed when he was transported to Westminster Abbey. One of the things I was attempting to do with this sculpture was to do what Adrian Jones was doing with that tiny little bow and with so many other parts of the Quadriga statue, which was to add something that was unnecessary in order to raise the sense that this was a sculpture at ease with itself, and that in order to give it some context, some suggestion of meaning. What I was trying to do was to represent him as if he was in the green room about to come out and give one of his blood-curdling readings of the death of little Nell, or something similar. He's actually sitting on a chair, and under that large drape, there is a chair, though you can't see it. I thought that giving him a curling pile of books to go with it would suggest something of his manifest genius. It's a horizontal piece. There was some question as to whether we should have a vertical, but the building behind it, long and wide, this is the Guildhall in Portsmouth. It felt to me right, looking at the aesthetic of the building behind it, that we should have a horizontal piece sitting in front of it. There were 40 Dickenses at the unveiling of the sculpture, all of whom were pleased finally to see a statue of their great forebear in this country. When you put up a sculpture like that, you have to spend a lot of time in the last few weeks curating the space around it, persuading local councillors that the bicycle racks that stand right next to the sculpture could be moved to a different place, cleaning the swastikas that have been scratched onto the lamppost off it, and creating an environment around the sculpture so that it can have aesthetic room to breathe. I want to show you one or two pieces by other members of the Society of Portrait Sculptors. We still want to make heroic sculpture. That last one was an unapologetic commemoration of Dickens's genius. So we still regard human virtues as something that we should attempt to commemorate, and even in a lasting and so-called permanent form in hard materials. This is Nigel Boonham's statue of Martin Luther King outside Newcastle University. Terrific folds and a terrific stance. Absolutely compelling piece, made even more so by the bronze lettering underneath it. Marcus Cornish's beautiful little sculpture of Tom Paine outside Lewis Library, struggling under the weight of the social order that he wanted to overthrow in the rights of man. This is Karen Newman's sculpture on the east bank of the Thames at the far side of Lambeth Bridge of Violette Szabo, a powerful public bust, larger than life size, with a terrific fortitude to it and a lovely loose modelling of the chest and hair, contrasting with the face. I love it. This is one of Anthony Dufour's fantastic miners. This one is in Cinderford. What I love about this is the way that the modelling of the figure almost seems to be made of the coal that is represented in the lower part of the sculpture. A lot of the heroic sculpture that we're making these days is of working men and women, not just of those who are considered to be at the apex of our society. This is a sculpture of an apprentice plumber that I made for the Worshipful Company of Plumbers, and it stands in Cannon Street Station, a kind of contrapposto hidden by a pair of overalls. This is Etienne Milner's quite fabulous sculpture of the Flesher, outside the Leatherworkers' Hall in London. It's got a kind of A-frame construction to it that reminds me of Rodin's Walking Man. And terrific strength running down that front arm and all the way down the back and down the back leg. Again, and more working figures. These are the Women of Steel in Sheffield. That's a larger than life-size sculpture, though larger than life-size for them, it's about 6'3" tall. This is a piece I made and set up 3 years or so ago to commemorate the women who worked in the steel industry during the Second World War and who were making armaments, and without whose vast labour force and 7-day-a-week efforts, the war would not have been won. I wanted to make a formal representation of the comradeship that got them through some extremely arduous work. And so it's a formal construction with some asymmetry thrown into it to give it life. So one figure is looking slightly askance, not straight ahead, and the two arms round their backs are in different positions. One is a welder and one is a riveter, and I managed to photograph this just when it had been, the patination had finished in the foundry, so you've got various bits of foundry equipment behind it, and in a way that's the site that I would most like to have bolted it into the floor at. It ended up in Sheffield, and here are some of the old ladies who worked during the war in the armaments industry. Terrific bunch of people who more or less terrified me with the requirement that I should get this sculpture right. It's rather distorted there, so it makes it look like, well, both they are distorted and the neck of the figure on the left is. Two of them travelled all the way down to my studio in Oxford from Sheffield in order to sign the piece off. They told me that they really wanted to look very attractive, if possible, in the sculptures. They told me we were quite something, they said. And so that was what I was attempting to represent. We had more than 100 women in their 90s and over the age of 100 in the crowd during the unveiling, many in wheelchairs, but finally, after, 70 years, their contribution to the war effort had been recognised. They were absolutely certain that it ought to stand directly on the ground so that other people could engage directly with it. And you often find photographs of it with queues of people linking arms and joined up. Another sculpture I made of two figures, it brings particular complexities to combine two figures together in terms of composition. I would say that it's 4 times harder than making a sculpture of a single figure. The relationship between the two figures needs to be absolutely right. The emotional temperature needs to be right. This is a sculpture of Sir Archibald Macindoe, the pioneering plastic surgeon who in the Second World War patched up so many RAF pilots who had been severely burned when their planes was shot out of the sky. He set up a hospital in East Grinstead where he brought his newly invented plastic surgery to bear on patients who would normally have died from the appalling nature of their wounds in previous years. But he managed to save them, and not only to patch them up physically, but also to reintegrate them into society. So many of these young men were thoroughly intimidated by the idea of going back out into the world and being seen with all their wounds and disfigurements on them. Archibald Macindoe invited all the local people who ran the pubs and the cinemas and the bars and the hotels to welcome these patients to their social events. And gradually they got used to coming out into society. And none of the 650 or so members of the Guinea Pig Club, as they called the organization of burned pilots, ever ended his life through suicide, in stark contrast to the many service people who, from their dreadful wounds in the First World War, were cast out into society and onto the streets without any hope of employment, and were often shunned. So he was a remarkable man. I wanted to represent not only him, but one of his patients. It came out in a rather kind of hieratic way. This has a whiff of a Pieta or something about it, which was not intended, but I hope that it helps to communicate some of the tender relationship between surgeon and patient. The airman has been burned on one side of his face. His hands are clawed. My father was actually a patient at that hospital. He himself was burned during the Second World War, not in an aeroplane, but a tank. And for the rest of his life, his hands were clawed in the same way. He couldn't straighten his fingers. And so as a tribute to my father, I included his hands in this patient. But so it's very much a father-son sculpture. Not only was I looking at my father's own history to research the piece. When I arrived there, I asked them whether or not they still had medical records from 1945. And they said, well, you're very lucky because we were just about to put them into deep storage. But here they are. And suddenly there were these photographs of my father as a 23-year-old, much the same age as my own son, staring out at me from these photos. For a whole decade after he was wounded, he had no photographs taken of him. And these were the first, together with all his typed up medical notes. So there were all sorts of things that brought my father back to life through this commission. The patient is sitting on what I fancifully imagine is some of the drapes that might go into the operating theatre. But it seems to me that the relationship between surgeon and patient is a paternal one as well. And these are some of the old members of the Guinea Pig Club who turned up for the unveiling. A rackety bunch they were too. This is a statue I made of Philip Larkin in Hull. I love these. I love the opportunity to make these monuments to sort of rather figures who don't lend themselves physically and in the manner in which they appear to the whole notion of statuary, and yet they march along through our lives with their great lyrical brains. And he is standing there, coming out of the station hotel and racing for a train, leaning slightly over and with a long slate indicating the shadow that might have been thrown by his illumination. His poetry is filled with the intimations of mortality, and I wanted to suggest that somehow with the long panel on which he stands. Words there from the first line of the Whitsun Weddings. And down at King's Cross, at the other end of the line, the statue is at Hull Station at King's Cross. Sorry for that being so out of focus. We have the end of the poem I want to create this sense that sculpture has a remit beyond its own physical space. And the same with the Betjeman statue, that by looking at him, you look at what he's looking at. He's looking up at the metal and glass roof of this fabulous train shed. And what I was hoping to do was to encourage the viewer to do precisely what he's doing. He was an architectural conservationist, and so I wanted to marry both the poetry that I inscribed in the slates under his feet and his perception of the great architecture that he wanted to save around him in the same piece. The words around it, and in the shadowless, unclouded glare, deep blue above us fades to whiteness, where a misty sea line meets the wash of air. By choosing those lines from one of his poems about the cliffs in Cornwall, I wanted to suggest that somehow the way in which we appreciate architecture and the way in which we appreciate landscape might well come from the same parts of our mind. Rather like the way he's looking up at the great moon of the clock there. The challenge really was, how do you make a romantic lyrical figure from this kind of teddy bear-shaped man? And I exploited his poetry in order to help me to do that. It's done, as it were, on the intake of breath. He's breathing in. A good sculpture often, it seems to me, a figurative sculpture looks like it's in a moment before a movement is resolved. What I was trying to achieve was the sense of inspiration, not only the inspiration of his poetry, but the inspiration in his respiration. He's breathing in this pose, and then you know that he will breathe out. There's an awful lot of this that goes on, which I didn't expect at all. Vandalism, really. We are seeing a lot of sculptures being removed at the moment around the world. This is a sculpture of General Lee being removed in New Orleans. Confederate statues, as you will all know, have been torn down, destroyed, removed all over the one-time Confederate South. And I'm in two minds about this, not because I think that the white supremacy that they stand for and that they energize, or the slavery that they fought a war to retain the right to practice, is anything to be lauded or celebrated. In fact, so many of these sculptures were put in at the end of the 19th century, in the early 20th century, to invigorate the Jim Crow segregation laws. And I think there's a very strong argument, therefore, for removing them. Not always for destroying them. This is a Confederate soldier. But I can fully understand the fury and profound upset of people who object to the politics that these monuments represent, and the visceral desire that you might have to remove them. In a way, we need to think more imaginatively, it seems to me, about them. Could they not be taken off their plinths and put down into pits, for example, rather like this intriguing sculpture in Zanzibar of slaves in a commemorative museum? Invert the plinth, maintain them there. It seems to me important that we should not only remember that there was a time that people kept slaves and that it was in many ways the basis of our own economy a century, 2 centuries ago. The empire became possible because we had slaves making it possible for us. We need to be reminded that not only did we keep slaves, but that for decades afterwards, we wanted to commemorate people who believed that that was a good idea. And therefore, the removal of their statues, it seems to me, removes in a different way what we need to remember. This is the statue of Rhodes in Oxford, where I live, There was a campaign to have him removed from the front of Oriel College. And that was resisted by the college, the argument being that so many donors would cease to fund the college if it was removed, which seemed to me a very poor excuse for maintaining it. There's now a plaque on the wall saying, sorry about slavery, sorry about the white supremacy that he advocated, which seems to me to be inadequate. In All Souls College, the Codrington Library, there's a rather fine neoclassical monument of Christopher Codrington, who funded the library. These great benefactors brought money to bear, and he was a slave owner in Jamaica. The college has put up a tiny little label on the wall as if to say, whoops, sorry about slavery, we're keeping the library. But then what do you do? Do you take the statue down? Do you take the library down? Out of its evil funding comes great learning. This is Colston in Bristol. Fine statue of a slave trader. So many buildings, public buildings in Bristol are named after him, the Colston Hall, all kinds of Colston, this and that. He made vast amounts of money, which he gave to the city of Bristol by trading in slaves in the Caribbean. Again, there have been interventions. A sculptor made this little piece in front of them in the shape of the slave ships, which seems to me to be a useful way of saying, this is what we are looking at here. And in a way, it also acts like a kind of shadow falling from the sculpture itself. And yet the sculpture stays up. And I make sculptures, and I admire the making of that sculpture in the way it was made, but not what it stands for. In Tate Modern at the moment, there's this huge sculpture by Cara Walker. It's a Mickey take of the Victoria Memorial at the end of the Mall. And it includes various bits of iconography about slavery and about the lunacies and idiocies and cruelties of the empire. This is the Victoria Memorial itself. That's at Queen Elizabeth's coronation. It shows you the size of the thing. And it's a quite fabulous monument representing the power of the British Empire. You can see why Cara Walker might have wanted to take the mickey out of it, because it doesn't admit to the dreadful history that energized it. This again is the fabulous figure on the top of it, an absolutely gorgeous sculpture. And yet you can see why she might want to re-represent it in this way, bearing in mind what that noose hanging on the left represents. I don't have any answers to any of this. I'm just attempting to reflect the cultural issues that coming up against in the world of making monuments at the moment. In many ways, I like the jokey sleight of hand here, the gestural quality of it, the rough modelling, the coarseness of it, the anaesthetic aspect of it, the way in which it is purposefully modelled with a coarseness that is the opposite of the aesthetic that informed the Victoria Memorial. And yet, it is gestural, and it will go, and the Victoria Memorial will stay. And how will we talk about our history from then onwards? I like these lazy sharks in the pool underneath it, reminiscent of sculpture in the Piazza Navona in Rome. The humour and the suffering that this sculpture engages. Now, there are a lot of sculptures around at the moment which seem to me to suffer from a kind of gruesome literalism, if that's not putting it too cruelly. Sculpture is, it seems to me, all about the form. It's about working with your brain, your arm, your eye, and interpreting and translating what you see in front of you into something else. If you become too literal and you begin to fetishize the detail on a piece of work, you will paradoxically drain the life from it. There is a sculpture in Parliament Square that recently went up that could not have been more needed insofar as it represents a woman. And there are 10 or 11 other sculptures in Parliament Square, all of which are of men, all of which were sculpted by men, and I can well imagine how outrageous that must have seemed to Caroline Criado Perez, who initiated the idea, when one day she was running through Parliament Square and realized this outlandish absence. About 15% of sculptures in this country are of named women, half of which are of Queen Victoria. This is a quite ludicrous injustice and misrepresentation of half of the human race. And yet the solution that the sculptor, again a woman, there was much celebration of the fact that the sculpture was made by a woman and is of a woman. Unfortunately, that woman sculptor is a conceptual sculptor, and she employed a man to make it for her. And that was not admitted to, and the sculptor who did make it did not get any credit for it. And it's not that we as sculptors don't work with other people. We always work, if we're casting bronze, with a foundry. Where possible, you credit the foundry. But it seems to me to be very important that if we're making these political points, they should be made honestly. If you put it up against that statue of Disraeli in the background, you can see some of the difference that I want to talk about. There is this sculpture here of Millicent Fawcett, the suffragette, was, as far as I can tell, 3D printed from a scan of a costume. It was barely modelled in the way that we've always modelled these things, by hand. There seems to be no drawing in it. And to me, it's a kind of loss of faith. And I hate to be criticizing a sculpture whose political justification I so value. But for me, this doesn't work. If we look at a detail, the boots, these have, where's the drawing in it? Where is the modeling? Where is the jeu d'esprit? Where is the running away with modeling and drawing and composition that you might see in a sculpture by Charles Sargent Jagger, for example? This is one of his soldiers, the sacking around the bottom of the leg of one of his British Tommies after the First World War. The bottom of the Fawcett statue, there are these representations of other members of the suffragist movement, rather than suffragette movement, sandblasted into the base. To me, it's redolent of nothing more than a kind of municipal cemetery way of doing it. And yet, of course, these people should be represented there. Again, if we look at a neighbouring statue, the one of the Earl of Derby, one that everybody will have passed by and barely noticed. Look at the panels just below it, used to illustrate his history in the same way that those little panels of suffragists enlarge on our knowledge of Fawcett. There's this beautiful piece of modelling relief illustrating his political life in the House of Commons. Look at the way those figures recede into the background from front to back, and that will be within about 1/4 of an inch of modelling. The fabulous drapery on the same figure and on the back of Disraeli. This is what I mean by brain, arm, hand, eye, and knowledge, and making something that is completely new. Lincoln in Parliament Square with his seat behind him, expressing so much about political power. Epstein's Smuts. A strange sculpture that a lot of people seem not to see the virtue in, but its oddities charm me. And I'm no admirer of the segregationist Smuts. This is it from the back. A strange Jacob Epstein form, expressing a lot of what I feel about contemporary sculpture in his fists. It's easy to attack a lot of contemporary work, but some of it really is not what it should be. If I was a doctor, I'd want that wrist looked at and those legs and that arm. and those trousers. This is a football manager at Portsmouth when it was unveiled. A member of the crowd said, well, it's nothing like Ted Bates himself, but it's a spitting image of the Southampton manager. Should give it to them. This is Ronaldo, and he's just loving it. There's wonderful sculpture around London, wonderful new sculpture. This is the Bomber Command Memorial by Philip Jackson. It's a powerful piece of work with every little bit of the Bomber Command uniform detailed in it. And yet it doesn't quite reach the fabulous qualities of the Artillery Memorial, quarter of a mile away. Jagger's composition. This is the officer on the memorial. The driver, a crucified figure with this beautiful fanning out of his cape and the contrast between the large blank areas of modelling and the detailing. This bag, you look at this bag and you can almost imagine what's inside it. You know the material it's made of. It's not made of a hard leather, it's made of a soft leather. You can imagine what he might have in it. It's got all the folds that a bag might have and some. It's pushed a bit further. This isn't any 3D scan of an actual bag. This is a bag that's gone through the man's imagination. And the symmetry and asymmetry of the legs, so that the pattern making in different parts of it is so compelling. To the extent that he can actually attach to it real chains and real parts of the driver's accoutrements. And they don't seem to be too detailed, too fetishizing, too much about the thing itself. When I was making a sculpture of Mary Seacole for the Garden of St. Thomas's Hospital, I had that bag in mind when I wanted to add a bag to her figure. She was a nurse who went down into the battlefields at the Crimea, and I tried to keep that Jagger bag in mind while I was modelling hers. She had a stiffer bag full of medical equipment, and I wanted to make one that you would want to know what was inside it. This is the figure itself. We went out to Crimea and cast a large panel from a rock face close to where she had had her base. And we throw a light onto it, again creating a shadow. I like this notion of shadows. They measure the incorporeal next to the permanent bronze and stone from which the monument is made, because monuments create this conceit that our lives last, that our virtues last beyond us. And yet, it seems to me that a shadow belies that. It suggests not only that we have feet of clay, that we have shadows in the way in which the shadow was defined in the psychotherapeutic sense, but that also that which is not physical tells of something beyond our lives. Put it into the garden facing Big Ben, a whole lot of circles all around there, the fountain in front, the clock face of Big Ben, the London Eye, and the sun descending in the west behind it. To me, this was like a clock face denoting time. The function of the work is also, of course, to inspire the young. There hadn't been a statue before of a black woman in Britain. And my sculpture of George Orwell outside BBC Broadcasting House, sometimes for me it speaks for the BBC, and at other times it speaks to the BBC. When I put it up, the BBC seemed to have one political colour to it, forever being attacked by the Daily Mail and the Daily Telegraph, and now it seems to have moved. And so the inscription on the wall, if liberty means anything at all, it means the right to tell people what they do not want to hear, is a challenge to political journalists and to each of us as we pass by. Orwell under the glare of Big Brother. Again, the shadow adds meaning to the piece. I'm trying to say, and that's his roll-up sticking out at the end of his finger, that this refers to each of us as we pass by. He's pointing at you. Really, we make these monuments, we want to suggest these so-called permanent values. We want to suggest something about immortality, and we make them in bronze and stone and hard materials. We fix them to the ground so they'll never move. And yet, what we're trying to represent is this inspiration, this respiration. Orwell standing there with his fist on his diaphragm. He couldn't breathe well, he had TB. And I'm trying to suggest something about reaching up into the air, about material becoming the immaterial. Not about the mortal becoming the immortal, but about the supposedly immortal that's implied by monuments becoming mortal. If our lives are no more than a brief flash of life between two eternities of oblivion, then can it really be true that something persists beyond us? So those words, and in the shadowless unclouded glare, deep blue above us fades to whiteness, where a misty sea line meets the wash of air, gets us to look beyond the sculpture into the air beyond the roof of the station. When I made the Larkin sculpture, I surrounded it with inscriptions from his poetry and was attempting to do the same there. The last lines of his poem, High Windows, are inscribed on one of these slates. And the words at the end of the poem are, and immediately, rather than words, comes the thought of high windows, the sun-comprehending glass, and beyond it, the deep blue air that shows nothing and is nowhere and is endless. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Martin. Now, has anybody got any questions at all you'd like to ask? There is a microphone hovering up there, and we'd be delighted to hear. I'm sure Martin will be very glad to answer any queries you might have or questions.
Can you answer?
No.
Hello, fabulous talk. Thank you so much. I'm really fascinated by the sculptures that you've done. For the choice of them, you seem to have a tremendous empathy with the subject, and I'm wondering to what extent that's important to you, and also wondering about how you approach research to personify the individual.
I do a lot of research. With authors, I'll try and read as much of their written works as possible to take the temperature of the man or woman, to get the mood right for a sculpture, which is not about, it's not the same as the biographical information that you might pick up from a biography or biographies. It's not the same as looking at images, which you do a great deal of. Usually you're representing people who are dead, so you have to take your information from imagery. If you're lucky, there'll be footage. There might even be recordings of people's voices. Orwell, there was no footage of Orwell. There were no recordings of his voice. There are none, as far as I know. There were only photographs of him. But I also wanted to... his medical history was quite important. So I listened to interviews and read about what the experience of having TB might be like. And the sheer difficulty of breathing, for example, that went into that disease informed the rather stiff pose that he was in. So he's sort of holding his lungs up to try and get enough breath in. So you get your information from wherever you can, often from the most obscure places, but you hunt about for it like a jackdaw, stealing it from here and there.
Thank you for teaching me how to look at statues in a way I didn't used to know how to do. You were surprised to see people mobbing Betjeman, your wonderful statue, which is so loved in the area. And I was surprised one early morning, about August the 29th. His birthday is August the 28th. And on the 28th, the Betjeman Society placed a bouquet of flowers and a birthday card in the wonderful bag you have, which is meant to be the bag of books you always carried. And I just wanted to remind everybody how much Betjeman is admired and your wonderful statue.
Well, I think I was pretty much riding on the back of the man's reputation. I mean, he was beloved in his own time. And if you make a sculpture that somehow comes off, and it is of somebody who was so, about whom people felt so fondly in his own lifetime, then it gives you a leg up that you might not have were you to represent a more villainous figure.
Hi, can I just applaud you on your sensitivities as a sculptor and what you've brought our awareness to? Absolutely applaud them. But I just wanted to ask you, have you any advice for someone who wants to break into the world of public sculpture for a first?
Do you make sculpture already?
Yeah.
You do?
Yeah.
Well, I make maquettes and I respond to competitions. There are many ways of doing it. Who would you most like to make a public sculpture of?
So I've been to my local council with my proposition, which, would you forgive me if I kept it close to my chest at the moment? But so they've categorically said no to me, and I'm just carrying on because I think my idea is brilliant and should be public.
I think you should carry on, and I think you should maybe look for a different site for it if there's objection locally. Make the model, and people will run with it if that's a good enough thing. Somewhere you'll find someone who is enthusiastic, and if you want to do it enough, you will find the skills along the way. So it's not about the skills; it's more about persuading the people who will commission it, because it takes a lot of money. You know, it's a very expensive business making larger than life-size bronze sculpture and putting it up in a public place. But if your sculpture has enough conviction, I will bet you'll get that made.
You're worth your weight in bronze and gold, man.
I'm afraid I'm turned up like a bad penny again. I'm afraid we now have to draw this event to a close because we're well over time. Thank you very, very much, all of you, for coming and for supporting the Society in this lecture. It's always a great event, and we're very, very appreciative of your support. As you're going out at the door, there are leaflets. If you'd like to become a friend and attend more things that we do or see about our friends' visits, we do lots of visits to studios. Also, there are forms for our annual exhibition for next year for you if you need to enter something. So please just pick one up on your way out. Thank you very much.